Next up, we have Josh Fisher. He's a scientist just up the road here at JPL. He's going to be talking about terrestrial ecosystems and land surface modeling. And let's all welcome Josh.
Thanks, Ryan. So Ryan and the organizers asked me to talk about terrestrial ecosystems and the modeling, land surface modeling. And Ryan asked me about a week ago. So I didn't have a lot of time. So this is basically pulled from my general research talk, which a few of you in the audience have seen. So apologies for that. And Leslie set up a good structure. I mean, she talked about the atmosphere, the oceans, the land fossil fuel components, and pointed to some of these key uncertainties in the land component. Now I'll be talking about really just the terrestrial ecosystems. What are these uncertainties? What are these processes? What are the things we think about from a terrestrial ecosystem perspective? And really trying to address this fate of the terrestrial biosphere as well as the rest of the planet. So our story begins in 1835 when Hans Christian Andersen wrote a children's story about a young woman whose royal identity was discovered because she had a true physical sensitivity of a very, very small pea placed beneath her bed that only a true princess would be able to feel. And in the morning, she woke up complaining about this discomfort, thereby verifying her claims to royalty. So the land surface in the Earth system is a very small component of the entire Earth system. Yet it exerts this enormous uncertainty, this breathing of CO2, and our uncertainty in future projections of climate are hugely dependent on this very small proverbial pea. So if we think about where these uncertainties come from, and sorry about it's hard to see, but these are all the different climate models that we tend to see in IPCC type assessments. And they're made up of land and atmosphere and ocean and other components. And so the land represents one component, contributing uncertainty or certainty. Now what are these models? What are these land models? Well, they're simplifications of reality. So you start with, maybe some land and throw a bunch of weather at it, maybe some CO2, and up pops an ecosystem, right? And if you change your rainfall or your humidity or something, you change your kind of ecosystem. That's kind of basically how these models work. Now, what are the processes in these models? Well, it starts from microns large pores on leaves called stomata that open and close. And when they're open, they take up CO2 and release water. And when they're closed, they stop taking up CO2 and stop releasing water. Yet these microns, large pores, are kind of like that pea in The Princess and the Pea. They are so small, yet exert this enormous impact on the entire Earth. We also deal with photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is comprised of very complex biochemical reactions, subsequent equations, but these can't all be processed in a global sense for every single leaf or every single species or plant type. So assumptions have to be made about how to scale up these fine-scale biochemical processes to large-scale representation. Transpiration, I told you water coming out of a leaf. I couldn't get a good picture of that, so here's like a picture of a geyser. You can imagine that there's water coming out of the leaf. Again, influencing weather and climate in terms of the latent heating versus the sensible heating. How do you scale up these individual leaf components to entire canopies or to entire ecosystems? Not all leaves are made equal. You've got bigger leaves at the bottom, more shaded, different angles. And so our assumptions and our scaling of these processes can't all be uniform for every single leaf or our ability to scale. And that presents some uncertainty or some challenges. How is light diffused through the canopy? Again, influencing how some of these reactions or processes get turned on or off. And how does it heat up the canopy? Again, this is a connection to some of the remote sensing images where we can see these temperatures. The canopies act as interception blocks for water coming down, so water might not hit the soil, infiltrating into the soil, instead of resting on the canopy, shutting down photosynthetic and transpiration processes because it presents a barrier, and evaporating back up. Getting the interception is important. Aerodynamics. The land surface was originally kind of included in climate type models, not as a carbon process, but as a aerodynamic process, as winds. These winds that Leslie showed influencing how carbon dioxide or clouds at the time moved around were influenced by the roughness of the land surface. Phenology and litterfall, a challenging process in models. You want to be able to, in deciduous plants or even evergreen plants, you want to be able to drop your leaves at the right time and in the right amounts and for the right reasons. And so getting these processes in the models correct is important. There are thousands and thousands of species, and not all species are created equally among the individuals within a species. But we cannot measure, we cannot model all individual species individually, similarly to the reasons why we can't model every single ATP in a photosynthetic process. So assumptions have to be made, and we'll talk more about this, I think, later, especially as we talk about new hyperspectral type trait approaches, and Ryan Pavlik has been working a lot of this as well. But up until now, or this future approach, most models, or nearly all the models that we talk about, group species into plant functional types, whether it's a tropical, grass, crop, deciduous, and you could have one grass, or you could have two grasses, or you could have three grasses. So the more plant functional types you have, the more computing resources are needed. But then you get better process representation. So there's this trade-off between how many PFTs, these plant functional types you have, and the amount of realism as well as computational demand are needed. And this represents a huge uncertainty in the land surface models, or the terrestrial biosphere models. Autotrophic respiration. So plants take up a lot of carbon and they burn that carbon for metabolism. They create the sugars and they burn the sugars. And we need to know that, especially under droughts, when maybe the gross photosynthesis or the gross carbon coming in has ceased because of lack of water, yet plants are still trying to metabolize and use up some carbon stores. How do we understand these carbon stores? And it's kind of like, how much money do you have in the bank? And it varies from individual to individual and life strategy to life strategy. Different plants allocate carbon to different components at different rates and for different reasons. So you could have plants that put on a lot of leaves, or put on a lot of wood, and that has implications for residence time and turnover. So again, splitting these up into the carbon and nitrogen allocation between leaves, wood, and roots. These are all processes represented slightly differently in different models. Back to water again. So water will come through that isn't intercepted and might influence the micro topography of ecosystems, not necessarily represented in the models, but still some aspect of this process is in these models. Soil layers and soil pools. This is another one that has this computational demand versus realism. There are multiple layers of soil carbon, as well as nitrogen and other nutrients. And the more layers that are in the model, again, the more computational demand is required. But Leslie alluded to the carbon stored in Arctic soils, in these permafrost soils. And there's huge uncertainties there. Again, enormous amounts of carbon there. And if those aren't represented well, both in terms of amount and process of transformation or release back to the atmosphere in the models, then we've got a lot of uncertainties on hand, and that's what we're finding right now. Nutrients. Nutrients have been ignored mostly in models up until recently. Not for lack of knowledge, but there's just a priority list. A lot of this is very new science. Climate models have not been around long. The land surface models have not, global land surface models have not been around long in a relative sense. And it's one thing at a time, carbon, water, and now we're getting to the nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus being the two most important ones generally, globally. Decomposition. It's like phenology. You want to be able to decompose your dead leaves at the right rates. You don't want all your leaves to like hit the ground and decompose instantly, but you don't want them piling up to the sky as well. So getting that decomposition process right, which is a mixture of water, temperature, and this carbon quality, is very important, again, with these droughts as water is changing, as temperature is changing, as the species or the allocation to leaves or types of carbon changes. These decomposition processes are increasingly difficult to understand. Heterotrophic respiration. There are millions and millions of bugs eating all those leaves and dead sticks and all the other roots and other material, and burping and farting that CO2 back up to the atmosphere. And that is that heterotrophic respiration. That is that's carbon going back at you, but we're not going to model all those individual bugs, right? I mean, again, so these assumptions have to be made to understand how to integrate across all these little bugs that are potentially behaving in different ways, maybe shifting their community structure as climate and moisture and temperature regimes change. Getting that right also is important for understanding the net understanding of carbon exchange or net ecosystem exchange of carbon dioxide, which Leslie showed for one of these flux towers, getting how much is coming in through photosynthesis, your GPP, and how much is going back out through that autotrophic respiration of the plants burning their own carbon, and the heterotrophic respiration of the bugs eating the dead material. It hovers around zero. If it's going in, then the biosphere is a carbon sink. If it's going out in a net sense, then it's a carbon source. And we want the biosphere to be kind of a carbon sink to help mitigate atmospheric CO2 concentrations and fossil fuel burning. But if there's a lot of droughts, or temperatures are changing, or there are fires, or bugs, we could easily have traditionally or historically carbon sinks turning into carbon sources, and we need to understand that. And that's contributing a lot to these uncertainties. Snow melt, an important process in terms of turning ecosystem processes on or off. Easy to see from space if there's snow there or not, but very hard to model in terms of getting rid of that snow at the right time in the right amounts. How water infiltrates through soils, again, affecting how much water is available for ecosystem processes to be turned on or off. Soil evaporation, again, influencing weather, like evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration, this is just fog, but you can imagine water coming off these plants. That would be the transpiration through the leaves and the evaporation off. And then the trace gases and aerosols, like the woman at the back was asking about. Another process of ecosystems also influencing climate and weather. Runoff, how is water distributed, available to us? How is it routed over the landscape and as this changes? And then, of course, all these water components have to balance each other. Again, not a picture of water balance, it's just a guy balancing over water. But if you don't have that water balance right, you'll end up having too much water in one place or another. You have dynamic components of ecosystems now, where you have competition between, between individuals, between species, duking it out for space or for light or for water or for nutrients. We've got establishment of new species or of existing species in gaps. Traditionally, establishment was, if a tree falls in a forest, which species gets to colonize it first. Now we've expanded this out into a global sense as we have new climate niches, as there's warming in the boreal or Arctic regions. Can new species invade or establish, or going upslope to beat the heat. And then how do you kill a tree? This is actually, I mean, you would think this is one of the most critical components in models or in our understanding of ecosystems, but our understanding of how plants die is not clear. You could run out of water and their vessels could cavitate and you know, they would die that way. Or if there was not enough water, they could just close off their stomata and not take enough carbon. And like I said, they require carbon to metabolize, and they could die from carbon starvation. So you've got kind of a couple competing things that are potentially killing trees, as well as less obvious or more obvious disturbance processes like fire. What is that? Is that me? I don't know. All right. So Siri is watching this presentation. Okay. So yeah, now if you ask Siri, what is the most important process, she should know. Okay. So you've got all these processes locked up into this very simplified model. But of course we know ecosystems don't look like this. They look more like this. And you've got all these processes overlaying on top of these types of ecosystems. And we're still trying to understand this. Now we've got all these processes, and of course within all these processes are multiple representations of these processes. It might be that the Americans think of photosynthesis one way, but the Japanese think about it another way, and the French think about it another way. And so these are, not only do you have lots of processes with lots of uncertainties, but you have lots of ways of representing these processes. And these are the reasons, or a lot of the reasons, why we have such uncertainties in our understanding of the terrestrial biosphere response to climate. And we look at the climate response here, and if we just focus in on the NPP, that what the plants are actually doing in terms of photosynthesis minus their respiration. The uncertainty is large enough that it actually encompasses this negative and positive. We don't know in the future if ecosystems, the terrestrial biosphere, is going to be a carbon sink or a source. It's not even like how much of a sink is it going to be or how much of a source it's going to be. We don't know either way. And where do these uncertainties come from? From these models, right? So this is the C4 MIP about, I think, 9 years ago or something from Pierre Friedrichsen. And you can see these models into the future diverge. Some go up, some go down. A lot of it has to do with their CO2 sensitivity versus their drought sensitivity. Again, these kind of competing forces. This was like 2006. I think it was 2006. Pierre redid this analysis in the CMIP5, and you would think that these models would improve with time, and this is what they look like more recently. So you can see that we're still struggling to reduce these uncertainties into the future. And like I said, the biosphere, this carbon cycle uncertainty is a huge component. Another way that I like to talk about these different models and these different uncertainties is it's like the blind men and the elephant, that fable, where you have different people trying to figure out what's happening in front of them without knowing the real answer. And everyone's saying something different. But everyone's also saying kind of the same thing. So it's a carbon sink, it's a carbon source. Depends if we have nutrients. Another thing about how these models are developed in our understanding, and we talked about where our measurements are taken. The models are also developed in the same kind of biased geographical representation. Here's a cartogram of where the models are developed, and they are where you'd imagine in the developed countries. But as we know, most of the process and the complication happens in, for instance, in the Amazon or the Congo or the boreal forest or the Arctic. So our understanding of how the world works is certainly influenced by the data we can collect and what's around us. And you can see why there's some bias there. So, of course, and then you throw this other monkey wrench into it. It's one thing, it's all well and good to say, there's a lot of differences out there, but then suddenly things are changing. It'd be great if things weren't changing. We could nail down our understanding of ecology and biogeochemistry. But now you've got this, right, which it doesn't even need axes anymore, right? It's just like you could have it like as a necklace, I don't know, or just it's like a symbol, a little bling. But yeah, that was, and this really influences the lungs of our planet. All right, so there's water, there's carbon, there's nutrients. They all interact with each other. They all influence climate, and climate influences them. You can look at this from an atmospheric and ocean standpoint. I look at it, and a lot of you in the room look at it from an ecosystem standpoint or vegetation standpoint, and a lot of outstanding questions, right? So if we look at the fate of the biosphere, there's kind of two extreme fates, right? You've got ecosystems thriving, what we call the beta factor in a simplistic way, or ecosystems collapsing, the gamma factor. And we want to know what's it going to be in the future? Which one is it going to be? And if we look at the models, we can run these experiments where you have the total carbon, basically, uptake. And if you just looked at CO2, CO2 is great. Plants love CO2. But if you throw in climate, such as droughts, you start to lose the amount of carbon taken up. And then if you throw in the human component, the land use component, like deforestation, you start to lose that more. So you can start to see that a little bit with models. So for the CO2 effect, Dave Schimmel, who I don't know if he's shown up yet, and Britt Stevens and I came out with a paper earlier this year that looked just at the CO2 effect. And we kind of split the world into the north and the tropics and the extratropics. And we used mass balance. And we basically gathered all our available data from atmosphere, atmospheric inversions, which I don't need to introduce because Leslie already did that for me, so that's great. She's doing it more rapidly now. I don't know. It's going to turn. OK. And we looked at our forest measurements, thousands and thousands of trees, and looked to see how much was lost from deforestation, but how much was gained from regrowth plus maybe a CO2 effect. And then older trees, established forests, that were still growing when you wouldn't expect them to grow because they were being fertilized by CO2. We looked at our land models with and without CO2 on. And all these three different kind of types or these communities looking at the CO2 effect started converging onto a zone where we were starting to figure out how much and where the CO2 effect was happening. Now, we don't know if this is going to happen into the future, but this is where it was over the last 10, 20 years or so. So that's great. So we know plants love CO2, and we can see this from lab experiments and field studies. But what about the climate effect? So if we look at the Amazon or Amazonia, and I think it was Ryan who talked about this.
Siri not available. Connect to the internet.
Michelle?
I do not know what Siri's doing, and
All right.
she's there.
All right. I think she really wants to connect to the internet, FYI. So Ryan talked about the Amazon forest dieback, like these models predicting the death of the Amazon or this retraction of the humid tropical forest. I mean, this is worrisome. This is our biggest breathing source of the terrestrial biosphere. Not to mention our treasure trove of biodiversity and other ecosystem services. Now, in 2005, it was the worst drought in our history of records that hit the Amazon. And there was a lot of tree death. I'm going to skip through this because Ryan already covered that, so that was good. And you had the original papers that said the Amazon rainforests were greening up because they loved the drought, because there was still plenty of soil moisture and there were just fewer clouds, so they can get more sunlight. But then you had, Amazon forest did not green up. So there's been a lot of work on this. Lots of papers. Again, but this is a critical question, so it spurs a lot of research. 2005 being the worst drought in the history of our records for the Amazon. 2010 was the worst drought. So these model projections of Amazon's going to die back because there's going to be more intense and frequent droughts into the future, we're already starting to see before our very eyes. What was different in 2010, unlike 2005, is we have a new measurement that looks not just at greenness, but at fluorescence, and I'll not talk too much on this because Christian Frankenberg will talk more on this later. NASA's also been on it for the past few years or so. We have a carbon monitoring system that has been integrating the ocean, the land, the atmospheric and anthropogenic observations and models together. I thought Leslie would talk about this. I didn't have to, but she didn't talk about it. NASA's trying to really constrain our understanding of the carbon cycle through observations and models. What about the boreal forest, the second largest biome? What's going on there? Well, we talked about methane and all this carbon locked beneath the permafrost that's now being exposed. How do the models do in this region? And here's a paper that I put out last year, just for Alaska, as part of the CARVE mission, where we looked at lots of different models and we said, what are the models saying in terms of whether or not Alaska is a carbon sink or source? And you can see that every single possible conceivable pattern of red versus blue versus yellow is illustrated in these models. It is like a giant game of Twister where all the kids are just like locked up and they fall on each other. And so there's this enormous uncertainty. And even like, not all models are created equally. The models that are supposedly better at that region totally disagreed with each other too. So NASA has just launched the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. It's a 10-year campaign, a field campaign-based campaign, which is very unusual in funding cycles to have 10-year cycles. And this is pretty exciting, and this is really to reduce this uncertainty in the region, scale up our sparse measurements, add more measurements, interface with the airborne, the satellite, and the modeling community to understand how to reduce these. And the first selections just got selected like 2 months ago. I was just at the first science team meeting last week, and it was pretty exciting. So there's also a whole philosophical component about how we decide which models are good versus bad. And this gets this moves away from quantitative and into the philosophical and political realm. If a model that's good at water but bad at carbon, is that as good as a model that's good at carbon but bad at water? Is a model that's good at annual cycles better than a model that's good at diurnal cycles? What about when we don't have enough data to confront models, and models that look good because they've kind of maybe tuned or gotten lucky to available data, but we don't have enough data in, say, like the Amazon? So there's a lot of development. Jim Randerson in the audience has been kicking that off, and it's been developing, but it's very difficult to kind of say which models are best and how do we reduce these uncertainties, how do we weight models against each other, how do we reduce that spread of uncertainty that the IPCC tends to depend on. Ryan showed this figure, which is how well is carbon space sampled, and this is kind of my animated version. That's the land mass. And we have two poles of the carbon cycle, right? That's our GPP, our breathing in. But then we've got the carbon stored in the soils, and there's a lot stored in the tropics and a lot stored in the Arctic. But of course, as Ryan showed, our sampling doesn't quite cover these two poles of the carbon cycle. And Ryan and Dave Schimmel and I and others published this paper earlier this year as well. So because our ground sampling isn't adequate, and probably won't be for a lot of regions, the Congo region, very important but very, very difficult both topographically and politically to sample it well. We're trying, but it's hard. So remote sensing. Now, we're in a bit of a golden age for terrestrial remote sensing. There are a ton of amazing products out there across water, carbon. We've got precipitation, snow, evapotranspiration, soil moisture, groundwater, runoff. We've got vegetation, water content, wetlands, inundation, freeze-thaw, the greenness. We've got fluorescence, canopy height, biomass, fire, chlorophyll, lignin, canopy, nutrients. I wonder if that's me. Is that me? I'm just going to turn off my phone. Mycorrhizae, land surface temperature, and so on. So we've got a whole slew of new observations out there that can now be used to constrain and confront these models. All right, just focusing a little bit on the water. So I talked a lot about carbon right now. Just the water component. If we look at the water cycle, and we have this uncertainty on water, the water cycle or water resources. We've got rain and snow, we've got evapotranspiration and soil moisture, the deep groundwater storage, and your eventual runoff. And the uncertainty on all these components leads to our uncertainty in water resources. We know this very well now in California. We can now measure from space or from remotely airborne and future space every component of the water cycle. So GPM, this global precipitation measurement, constellation it has kicked off to advance past the tropical rainfall measuring mission, TRMM. We can see that snow, but we can also fly around with LiDAR, getting that snowpack and albedo, and converting that to water content. Evapotranspiration, this is one of my specialties. We can track the energy required to evaporate water, not necessarily the water itself as a molecule, but water vapor flux as a latent heat flux. And we just got this new mission called EcoStress, which Ryan talked about, and I won't talk much on it because we'll have more this afternoon on that. SMAP, the soil moisture passive mission, I guess, and it's okay. That was a low blow. I'm on the SMAP team, but getting soil moisture, and then the groundwater using GRACE to look at gravitational anomalies as more groundwater pulls the satellites towards the Earth, more or less groundwater pulls the satellites to Earth less. And then using that same kind of LiDAR technique that we use for snow to look at topography, we can start to look at the height of rivers or reservoirs as well as the ocean, and that'll get us that last runoff component. So now we're able to kind of reduce these uncertainties as we start to bring it down. And of course, this is a cartoon, so I can make my uncertainty go to 0, but that's not, will never happen. We also talk about scaling, right? As water use is very heterogeneous in space and time. A lot of different techniques are used to scale up, and in using evapotranspiration as an example, we can have these ground towers or drones scaling up. We can go to airborne and up to space. I built sensors that you can put into trees to measure how much water is being used. All right, so the flux towers, we mentioned they can measure carbon dioxide. They can also measure water fluxes. We're working on drones to measure fields and go through forests. We've got airborne capabilities that can look at water through temperature, high tests, and there's other airborne capabilities looking at a lot of things we'll talk about, from fluorescence to hyperspectral, LiDAR. I'm not going to go through all the airborne components. The evapotranspiration, which I showed. So we can get all the water components from space, which is exciting. Running out of time. Last component, nutrients. All right, let's look at the CO2 rise again in the context of photosynthesis. Where is that red in this equation? It's right there. So if this is increasing kind of at an exponential, seemingly exponential rate, and you have water and energy, let's say for light is not limiting. Let's say you had enough water. What does this mean? Well, you kind of get something that looks like that, right? It goes to exponentially higher, and that's what the models are showing, right? They show this, the net primary production or the vegetation carbon goes up and up and up and up and up. So much so that it's unrealistic how much carbon that is. We see these numbers, but what does that actually mean? Like in our front yard, it kind of means something like this, right? On our mailbox, right? You have to put that carbon somewhere, and but the models are not limited by nutrients, as anyone who has had a garden know. You put some nitrogen or phosphorus on it or potassium, and you get more growth, which means that there isn't enough nitrogen or phosphorus generally in natural ecosystems. And models that have been putting it in, put nutrient cycles in, have shown drastic or fundamentally altered behaviors. I took a survey of nearly 100 modelers or modeling groups and asked them, what processes have you developed in the last 5 years in the model? And I put it into a Wordle where the size of the word or phrase is reflective of the response rate. And you can see in the past 5 years, these are all the processes: soils, nitrogen's there, land use, hydrology. And then I asked them again, what processes do you expect to develop in the next 5 years? And here's that Wordle. So you can start to see where we are in a developmental standpoint of these of the model processes and the dynamics. I've been working on a lot of this. This is just from my research talk. I'm not going to skip through this. So yeah, fun. I'm putting fun into climate modeling. Yeah. There's also mycorrhizae, these fungi, which basically go and find nitrogen or phosphorus and give them to the plants. And mycorrhizae are associated with or attached to nearly every single species on the planet. It's like a giant underground, Wall Street economy where mycorrhizae are saying, "I've got nitrogen," and the plants are like, "I got carbon." So it's kind of like, so we're putting that into models. But the type of mycorrhizae is very important. Sorry, I'm skipping through because I got my yellow light on. We're also able to pick up some of this from remote sensing, where individual species with different spectral fingerprints have qualities in common depending on which mycorrhizae they're associated with that are unique relative to the others. And we have a paper that is in minor revision at Global Change Biology that used about 140,000 trees and showed that we can detect this mycorrhizal association from space. Skip through the face experiments, fertilization experiments. But basically these nutrient cycles are being put into the models to reduce this exponential rise into something more realistic that we're seeing both with data and to curb that ability to go exponentially higher. And one of my postdocs, Ming-Jae Shi, just had a paper accepted in GCB talking about a lot of these dynamics. We'll skip through this last slide. It's coming right up. And so we also have techniques to look at nutrient limitation. We're talking about the synergy across multiple instruments. We also have nitrogen use efficiency, using water, carbon, and nutrients as they intersect to develop new ecosystem science. So that's pretty much it. And and hopefully our advancements in the science will help us really understand what that physical sensitivity is to that P or that terrestrial biosphere, and so we can really know if what we're looking at is real or not, is royalty or not, and hopefully we can live happily ever after. All right, thanks.